I scoffed lightly as I laid eyes on the lone mercenary contracted by my scribe to guard my carriage through Rallet lands. Though the Orvin and Rallet were on good terms politically, those snot-gargling brutes couldn't rein in the roving marauder bands within their borders, necessitating the exorbitant prices mercenaries could fetch. An adult male Rallet could rend enchanted Lutherian steel as though it were a single sheet of parchment. That was, of course, not accounting for skin so thick that blades could barely bite into it. Their bones are 4 times denser than even the squat, mountain-dwelling Lutherians, to the point even one of their own warhammers could hardly dent their skulls. I should know. I have watched the pig-faced savages fight each other with unbridled ferocity without sustaining a single fatality. So why, with all the knowledge I had so desperately tried to drill into their skull, did my scribe hire that? Their skin was not the ruddy reddish-orange of a Rallet, nor the pallid steel grey of the Lutherian, not even a touch of the beautiful delicate green of the Orvin like myself. No, it was a sickening beige-pink colour where it wasn't covered by plain, unenchanted, mundane steel armour or red and white striped gambeson. A simple short sword and unadorned buckler were strapped to their belt. A soldier's spear stuck into the ground between 2 paving stones as they helped the servants lift one of my many heavy trunks of luggage into the carriage. Smock? The name dripped from my lips with belly-concealed vexation. The young scribe letting out a squeak as they rushed over. Yes, my lord? Letting my rose billow regally with a small pinch of magic as I turned, I gestured with a flat palm at the lone mercenary. What is that thing you hired supposed to be? I could see the terror in his pale blue eyes as he stammered and started his excuse. It's a human, my lord. A paladin, to be exact. Though I'm afraid I don't know exactly what a paladin is, my lord. He came highly recommended by the Novril family, no less. The hand I had raised to strike my petulant scribe instead found its way to my wispy beard in a stroking motion, my gaze turning back to the human who was still helping the servants load my luggage. That is partially my fault, Smock. In that case, your last lesson before my voyage will be on... I felt my upper lip stiffen into a grimace as I let the word fall from my lips like a curse. Paladins. I turned swiftly, startling Smock badly enough that he almost lost focus on the levitation spell holding his inkwell. Grabbing an ancient tome from one of my many bookshelves, I'd opened it to the page on Paladins. Where every other mercenary profession had chapters and even entire tomes on their abilities and preferred equipment. With venom on my lips, I read the entire excerpt in a single breath. Paladins, otherwise known as holy soldiers, are a mercenary class rarely, if ever, seen. They draw power directly from the god they worship through worship and rituals, to perform miracles and smite evil in their deity's name, thus foregoing any direct control over their abilities. Little else is known about this profession, and any mercenary claiming to be of this fabled profession should be assumed a liar. I snapped the tome shut with a look of abject disappointment leveled towards Smock. The young Orvin male looked as crushed as I felt annoyed. He didn't dare mumble an apology as I set the tome back on his shelf. With a dramatic sigh, I set a palm on his head and state, However, perhaps I should withhold my judgment, especially if you weren't lying about the Novril family's recommendation. Perhaps they are a simply excellent fighter. Continue your studies, I must converse with our hired help. Strolling regally out of the library, I step onto a floating disc of air, directing it with soft nudges of power to carry me out into the courtyard. The massive manor doors opening of their own accord as I approached, chin held at a haughty angle. I expected at least a gasp of awe, but instead I was greeted by a plain, "Morning, boss. We almost got you all loaded up. Ahead of schedule at that." I felt a scowl forming on my face as I filled my voice with magical power. "Kneel." From the corner of my eye, I watched as my servants were brought crashing to their knees as though dragged down by an invisible hand. But the human remained standing, curiously glancing over their shoulder at the now grovelling servants. For a moment I thought I saw a glimmer of anger in their copper-coloured eyes, before a look of concern crossed their face. "We're gonna be late if you keep that up, sir. You don't want to cross Rallia at night, but a smart fellow like yourself probably already knew that." I clenched my jaw at the comment, scoffing the spell away and letting my servants rise. "And who are you to command me, mortal? I could reduce you to a streak of grease on the flagstones with a word." The hardness that entered the mercenary's eyes, paired with the calm, assured resting of their palm on the hilt of their short sword, almost gave me pause. Not even the greatest marshal on the planet would dare to make a threat like that against a scholar such as myself. Snarling, I'd blow past the mercenary on my dais of enchanted air and enter my carriage, slamming the door behind me as I settled into the plush interior. Letting out a huff of disdain while I pulled my books from their pocket dimension, a set of spectacles appearing on my long, thin nose as I opened the tome to a section on rare alchemical reagents. After only a few short minutes, I felt the carriage lurch forward as I began my journey. I found myself occasionally pulling the blinds aside to glance at the so-called Paladin as they marched alongside the carriage. I scoffed and rolled my eyes as I saw the little servant girl riding on their shoulders, giggling excitedly as the mercenary hiked along the rough roads, unabated by the weight they shouldered. How can one expect to fight anything after exhausting themselves like that? Picking up what appeared to be a brass bell without a clapper before speaking into it. "Her legs aren't broken. She may walk." Knowing my order had been heard through the bell's twin mounted to the exterior of the carriage, I returned to my book. If I was lucky, this trip would be over by sunrise tomorrow, and I could abandon this petulant human in Rallia's capital city of Wormbone and hire a more competent mercenary. Or perhaps I could even request a diplomatic escort from their royal army. The carriage suddenly lurched to a stop, my reinsman's voice echoing to me through the bell. Well, according to the hired help, there's an ambush up ahead. They're marching ahead, my lord." I'd laugh and respond, "Let them. Saves me coin." Yes, my lord." I barely returned my attention to my book when the carriage started forward again. My brow furrowing in confusion, I picked up the bell again and asked, "What happened? Why are we moving again?" They gave them their spear and they just walked away. I've never seen anything like it before, my lord." Left with more questions than answers, I set the bell down and let the carriage roll forward while I pulled the blind slightly to the side to peer through. A nice cold pit of terror settling in my stomach as I laid eyes upon the dozens of hulking rallets in the tree line. Their dull red eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't place as they stared at something ahead in the road. Unable to tamp my curiosity down, I waited until we drew alongside the apparent spectacle. The gasp that left my throat was unbecoming of a scholar such as myself. The sight before my very eyes was one I failed to comprehend. A Rallet war chief, clad in thick armor scarred by many battles, knelt before the human, head bowed as though in prayer, while the human held their palm out over its hairless head. In the war chief's hand, the human's spear looked puny, but the beast held it with a reverence becoming of an arcane artifact. Closing the blinds, I found myself agape. I had witnessed the spectacle with my very own eyes, and yet I still felt bewitched by the evidence presented to me. Who was this strange human to whom even a Rallet war chief knelt? Before long, I was scouring my ancient tomes for answers. Books on Rallet traditions and customs piling onto the seats of the carriage, as I looked for answers that eluded my grasp like non-magical smoke. But in the end, my search turned up nothing of even the slightest relevance. For the first time in my life, I felt like a student again, confronted by information so bizarre and foreign that my brain screamed for answers. Picking up the bell as I stood, I'd float out of the carriage on my dais of magical wind, stating, "I'm going to have a small chat with our hired help." I didn't have to hover far, as the mercenary plodded up alongside me, thumbs tucked in the armholes of their chestplate as they walked. I noted that they hadn't even broken a sweat after hours of walking over rough terrain. How did you do that? Some kind of spell or drug? In all my centuries, I have never seen a war chief bend the knee. The mercenary wiped their nose in thought, revealing the thick calluses on their palms. However, they were not the calluses of a fighting man. They were too uniform, too thick to have been formed by swinging a sword. They were the calluses of a hard labourer, a peasant, yet more questions without answers. He recognized me and asked for mercy. I almost gave myself whiplash, turning my head to stare incredulously at the human. It wasn't the words that surprised me, but rather the steadfast confidence within. Then why did you give him your spear? I didn't like the smile that came to the human's face. It was not a smile of pride or joy, but a cold smile that brought an icy lump to my throat. A warning to the other warbands in the forest. Stay out of my way. I shuddered beneath my robes despite the heat. This human had an aura about them that I couldn't place. Too confident for a simple warrior, too brash for a scholar. Each word almost dripped with an authority unbecoming of someone in such a simple garb. It was time to dig. You call yourself a paladin, yet you do not carry yourself like a priest does. An almost chiding laugh. Paladins are holy warriors, not holy men. You'll find the vast majority of us are sinners like yourself. Much like the priests you're used to, we also draw upon our faith for strength, though it is a far more tangible kind of strength. I'd nod softly, almost giddy with curiosity as I made a mental note of the statement. I was under the understanding that you drew your strength from the god you worship. Is that incorrect? Not entirely, just extremely simplified. A paladin's relationship with their god is more akin to a student and their master. We are only as strong as our belief in and conviction towards what our gods stand for. You said gods as in plural. Do you answer to more than one higher power? I do, yes. The abruptness of the answer caught me off guard, making me look the mercenary up and down in surprise. Would you care to elaborate on that? Nope. I bit my tongue to stop from cursing. I'd been so close to the answer only to be halted by purposeful ambiguity. Grumbling under my breath, I'd hover back to the carriage and sequester myself inside, poring over my books in search of answers I knew they did not have. Over several painstaking hours, I combed every passage and paragraph to glean as much or as little information on paladins as I could. Just as I opened another tome, the carriage came to an abrupt halt, sending books spilling to the floor. You might want to see this, my lord. My rainsman's voice echoed through the bell, panic staining his words. With a heavy sigh, I hovered out of my carriage and turned my eyes forward, blood running cold. Blocking the road ahead was a massive warband of rallets, skin blistered and blackened by the corrupted blight one was likely to catch in the dark forests. The massive rallet warchief Merlia knelt before the impossibly large and bloated with blight leader of the blighted rallets. Yet, with that impeccable confidence, the mercenary stood between the carriage and the warband. The bloated rallet reached behind their back and drew the top half of a broken spear. The war chief Merlia stared at the mercenary pleadingly, a look that was utterly terrifying coming from such a massive being. The bloated rallet drew the broken spear back like a dagger. You are forgiven, Caven. You may take your seat at the banquet without shame. A look of solace came over the rallet's face before the spear point was stabbed through the back of his neck. Yet, as gruesome as it was not what grabbed my attention. That was the whisper in the wind that carried the mercenary's voice. I took a step forward, intending to blast the blighted rallets away with a word of power, but the mercenary held up a hand, and I found myself forced to stop in my tracks by some invisible force. It was like the gods themselves had commanded me to stop. Slipping a hand through the buckler's handle and drawing his sword, the mercenary would kneel and stab the tip of their sword into the dirt, folding his hands over the hilt. As though it were a shout, the whispered prayer carried itself to my ears. Lord of the battlefield, Father of bloodshed, hear my call and listen. Grant me your strength and swiftness so that I may rise victorious in your name. Lady of grace, Mother of compassion, hear my call and listen. Grant me your temperance and wisdom so that I do not lose myself to mindless rage. Lord of the Dark, Father of Entropy, hear my call and listen. Have mercy upon their souls in death, for I shall show them none. Amen. A presence descended over the lonely forest road as the prayer reached its end, ancient and blood-soaked. A large bird of prey alighting on a branch nearby as another presence descended, bringing with it a gentle warmth that soaked deep into my bones. A small white bird with a ring of dark feathers landed gracefully next to the bird of prey. A moment later, as though the presence had always surrounded them, a large oily black carrion bird landed next to the ringneck bird, all three observing the mercenary as he slowly stood up straight and touched the short sword free from the dirt. Lifting the blade up as if to examine his own reflection, he let it catch an errant ray of sunshine. No, he wasn't just letting it catch the light. The sword itself was beginning to glow, as though drinking in the radiant sunshine. Then he crossed his sword and shield before striking them against each other, igniting both in holy flame. Then he charged, and by the time I had blinked thrice, it was over. Black blood sizzling on the sword's radiant edge as he held the tip point down over the bloated Ralit's throat. Placing the hand with the buckler's palm on the hilt, he drove it down, silencing the pitiful, keening cries of the war chief as easily as one would tie their shoe. Standing, the paladin let out a deep sigh, the oppressive presences simply vanishing into thin air. Leaving behind an eerie silence not even the chirp of birds dared to break. Sheathing his sword and hanging the buckler from a hook, he kneeled beside the first war chief and extended a gentle hand to close their eyes. You wanted to know which gods I served. It was a statement, not a question, but still I nodded, awestruck. The paladin looked up to the sky as he stood, revealing a sorrowful look. There's your answer. Now, let's get moving before we catch the blight. Gulping softly, I clambered back into my carriage, too disoriented and terrified to think about using my dais for transport. For the briefest moment, I had seen the true power of a paladin on display, and it terrified me. I would have liked to say I was surprised to make it to Wormbone without further delays, but as the paladin opened the door and helped me out of the carriage, I'd asked, Can I extend your employment until we get back to the manor? Of course, sir, if it would make you feel safer. I just nodded, gently, knowing there were no better hands I could put my life in.